Good morning, everybody. We're live here on Wednesday, January 10th. It is Wild Card Weekend. The regular season is in the rearview mirror officially, and we're down to the very home stretch of the NFL season. 6 games to go this week. We will talk about each one. We'll talk about the sides. We'll talk about the totals. We'll answer any questions that everybody has in the chat along the way as well. Appreciate 150 people here to get the morning started. See if that number gets up and over 350 as the live stream gets going. It's a big week, and surprisingly, not a lot of opinion shared yet publicly. So I think this might be one of the earlier shows to go. So hopefully some other folks as well that may be recording of their own or may have questions that are yet to be answered, please put them in the chat. We have 6 games to talk to, obviously much different from 16 like we've had the last couple of weeks. Those shows have gone for about 90 minutes. I think we can keep things around an hour today, if not maybe even shorter. But we can also spend a little bit of time getting to more questions as well from everybody. So in the live chat on the right, if you're watching on the desktop or in the YouTube app, you can leave your questions on the side. Let's get to all the questions as possible. If you're watching after the stream has finished, you can leave those questions down below in the video. I just want to say that right now the channel is at 7,925 subscribers. We have 75 more to go to get to 8,000. And so if you have yet to subscribe, you can do so down below. As I mentioned last week, I'll be doing some live streams during game day throughout the playoffs. So if you want the notifications sent to your phone right away, if you hit the subscribe button down below, there's a bell icon. You can switch that on and you'll get a push notification to your phone when the show goes live over the weekend. So if you are sitting down on the couch, you're getting ready for the game, you want to join in those live streams on game day, you can do that as well. All right, let's check in with everybody here in the channel. Bryce Miller says, I've been missing you at the gym this week. That doesn't mean I've been going to the gym, but doing a little running, believe it or not, trying to get ready for summer, but referring to the podcast. The daily podcasts end at the end of the regular season. Quite frankly, when you have 6 games, could probably do it for Wild Card Weekend. It's just hard to do something every single day talking about the games and line movement when you get to the playoffs, and not a lot changes as the week goes on past Monday or Tuesday. So daily pods are done. We'll keep doing the live streams, but good to have you back here, Bryce, as well. Kyle, I see a couple of questions from you. Just want to get to a couple more hellos. We've got a millionaire watching the show. Matt St. Marie, the winner of Circa Millions, has been watching the live streams all season long, took down the main contest. So big congratulations to Matt. Says, want to say a big thank you for what you do each day and week between this and the live stream and your daily market updates. Truly helpful to wrap my head around each week's slate. I'm very glad to hear that this has been a small part of all the success that you have had this season. Hopefully more continued success coming, but a significant achievement to take down that contest as well. So you should get some love from everybody in the chat for being able to do that. A amazing season of football handicapping from Matt over in the Circa Millions contest, taking it down. So a big congratulations to Matt, and great to see him back for another live stream as well. DB Gnarly says, thanks for doing this every week. Most times I cannot listen live, but I always listen. Love to hear that as well. David Rosansky, good morning from Buffalo. The drive into work isn't the same without the simple handicap. Those episodes will be back in August. It's closer than you think. But they'll be coming back. No question about that. Garrett says, good morning. Same thing to Murray. Jay Nava back for another show. Also seeing Gerard, Austin, Jordan. Happy Wild Card Weekend from Garrett. We'll talk about some props as we go. Joe English, Casey, Devin, Jordan, Nino, Rich. Here we go. Bruce getting it as well. And now the deservingly congratulations to Matt going into the channel. Great interview on VSiN. Congratulations, Matt, from Gerard. Lots of folks getting the well-deserved congratulations over to Matt. Good for him to take down that contest as well. Joe Lupo sighting and an Eric Meyerchuk. Hello and good morning to you as well. Let's get to the questions here before we jump into the games. Kyle Potswald says, morning, Adam. Do you view teasers any different in the playoffs? For example, teasing up a dog might not be as effective with season on the line. Interesting point. I do not have any numbers specifically for those underdogs being teased up. I think that's an interesting thought around it, where you might get those desperation drives late that aren't necessarily converting into points, but more so trying to get the game extended, treating offensive play calling a little bit differently. There's definitely some truth in that. I would say the the good thing about teasers in the playoffs relative to a teaser in the regular season is, and maybe certainty is the wrong word, but I would say there's a lot more certainty around the teams and the effort that you're going to get. Teasers are the best when the uncertainty is the least. So the reason being, you want those teased points that you're getting in your favor to hold the most value. If you have two teams that are playing each other where there's very little uncertainty about who is playing, what kind of rating those teams play to, the status of the quarterbacks, key players, and the effort, obviously, in the playoffs is going to be never questioned for any team. But when you have games like that, I would say that teasers tend to be more valuable in those spots, where obviously in the regular season, you can get teams that are going through all sorts of changes on a weekly basis. So I would say that that is the big difference between playoff teasers as well as regular season teasers. I would say this week, just at a quick glance, based on what I've heard, listening to other shows, in a couple chats, I would guess that Dallas is probably going to be the most bet teaser leg of any week all season long. I would assume that the Cowboys at home in that teaser spot are just going to be in every possible ticket everywhere. And then you kind of have to decide with that is where do you want to go? Do you want to take the Texans at home? Do you want to take the Bucs at home? Or do you want to pay a little bit extra and get those Bills teased down with the weather in that game? We'll talk about each of that as we go, but definitely something to think about with teaser info there. Nat says, do you ever tease totals? No, because there's very few ranges outside of the rare preseason totals that you get nowadays that are very few and far between. But during the regular season, there's just not a lot of ranges that you can tease a total up or down where you're getting a valuable bet from it. Now, I will say it appears that there is a bit of a caveat to that when we're getting these super short totals. We have one this week, but during the regular season, at times when we were having those Jets games in the low 30s, you were getting some Steeler games in the low 30s. Those kind of take on the same idea as the preseason teasers when you get those totals in that same range. But no, in general, never teasing those totals in the regular season or in the playoffs, just because you're not getting a lot of value with the range that you are covering. Catching up, any other comments that show up in here before we get to the games? We have one from Fiddy. Hey, Adam, how do you determine when you bet a game? Example, if you know an opening line is trending to a key number, do you bet it before the market moves or wait later in the week to bet a side? Obviously, you want to time it right as often as you can. In many cases, that's a very difficult thing to try do or to estimate. I would say some general tips that you could follow to kind of see where things might be going would be, one, look at market ratings and projections just to get kind of a good understanding of where the lines should be based on how they have closed to date. And that'll give you an idea of what kind of ranges these teams should be priced in. And then compare that to the openers or whatever point in the week that you are looking at to see, is there a big discrepancy between the market ratings and where numbers should be based on those compared to where they are now? And you can kind of jockey around key numbers to see if there's any difference there. For example, if you have market ratings saying a game should be 3 and you see that game currently in market early in the week at 3.5, you kind of have to start asking why. In many cases, you may find it's more likely to trend back towards market. Is one team a little bit overrated because of a big win, and that's the bump? Are there injuries? Things like that. I wish there was a simple and kind of succinct answer, but I would say the good starting point for this, if it's something that you're trying to think about, would be get those market ratings. In Predictable's a good source. They have them publicly available. There's aggregate ratings posted on Twitter. Use those as a starting point. Compare those to the market numbers that you're seeing on the board, and you can kind of start working backwards from there. I would also recommend using an odds screen. Something like Spank Odds is pretty good for anybody who wants the free tier and you don't want to pay for it, just to see different books, how the influential books, Chris, Pinnacle, Circa, some key PPHs, how those dictate the market versus how recreational books and apps in the US kind of follow in line. But that'll give you a good display of it. There's also some free odds comparison websites that you can search out through Google, but that would be a good step number 2 once you kind of get your head around where prices should be in the ratings and the market numbers. Garrett, I'm just scrolling back through. I'll get to those prop questions that you have best as I can. Still early in the week, but we'll get to that too. What else is coming up here? Don't tease 50-plus point total games. So Casey makes a good point, right? This is what I was saying about teasers. When the uncertainty is the least, that's when you want teasers, because they tend to be more valuable. If you have a high total, for example, the Cowboys game, 50-plus points, the higher the total, the slightly less valuable each point that you're teasing on the side becomes, because there's more points expected in the game, which tends to mean more variance. Obviously, if you can reduce that with shorter totals, that would make teaser legs more ideal. Austin, we have a season-ending package up. It's $59 on the website. We have not released anything yet this week. To answer Nathan's question, I hope that we have one. We've had a lot of discussion, which I'll get to, about all these games that kind of have us in between a lot of possible options. But that would be something that you can look at on the site if you want it. I would expect probably 2 or 3 more releases tops in the playoffs is what you might be looking at. So keep that in mind. One more question. Corey George says, have you read the Billy Walters book, The Gambler? Does RAS use similar principles of power rankings teams and using that to create internal lines to find divergence? This is maybe a really good question for like an individual show or something off season, going behind the scenes. I would say that the difference is that, yes, we have internal ratings. We also have people that make numbers internally. We also value external numbers quite a bit internally as well, based from other sources. A lot of different people have different skills that can do things better than perhaps you can find full-time in-house, and they do things really well. And so we tend to rely on those too. And then it's a lot of, I would say the biggest asset that RAS has is the experience. Ed, Jeff, Mike, Matt, Travis have been around for years at the highest level, having success, and their ability to intake all this information, filter through it, and come up with the right decisions to bet on is second to none in the industry. And so it's constantly between the 16 people working, the research that's being done, the info that's being gathered. It's just kind of a mass filtering process that I think would be a little bit unique based on what you've seen in that book. So I think we can get to that in a non-wildcard preview show where we can dive into things a little bit deeper too. Looks like we're all caught up. One more comment from Andrew before we get going. I echo the sentiment around missing the simple handicap every morning. Will you perform a post-mortem once the season is completed? If so, what is your approach? Any thoughts on Fave strong run? Good question here too, Andrew. I'm going to plan on doing more off-season content than I have in the past. I believe a lot of that, if not all of it, will be written. I'll have updates on that as we go. I would like to kind of just take a little bit of a break from the video and the audio, do some more writing. This is perfect for that kind of topic. I appreciate everybody who left comments last week about what the best topics would be, and we'll include that as well. Okay, let's get to the games. Please keep the questions coming as we go game by game. We got some time here. We can ease into it and go a little bit deeper into each of these games. Something that I was recommended to do by a number of folks, but also someone who helps me out a lot with the media, is we're getting into the playoffs. There's very few games. The last 2 weeks, week 17 and 18, I felt like I was waffling quite a bit. I think that represents the market, though, and kind of shows you that, hey, can be really tough, and some of these games move a lot. For each playoff game and through the Super Bowl, I'm going to give my opinion on each side, and I want that to be sort of caveated with the fact that we have not released anything from the service yet. And so when I'm saying that I'm going to give you my opinion, a far difference between, hey, this is what I think about a game and opinion versus something that is going to be released. But I want to at least give everybody kind of the quick thought that I have on each game, and then we'll dive into some deeper information. So at least you're watching this, you take away an opinion from me, and you can use that as you may. And so that's something that I'll do for each playoff game and into the Super Bowl, something to keep in mind. So with all that said, let's get into it. We start off Saturday early, 1:30 p.m. Pacific time. It is the Cleveland Browns on the road at the Houston Texans. Browns currently a 2.5-point favorite, minus 115 across the board. Total in this game is 44.5. We've seen pretty clear movement and buy points on this game. This game opened as the first wild card game. It was a 1.5-point number hung on the Cleveland Browns. That was bet all the way out to 3. And that initial move came later in the day on Sunday. Once the games were settled after Buffalo, Miami, we saw this number push out. The total has been slowly creeping up as well from 43.5 to 44.5. So it's been movement on the Browns, movement on the over. My opinion in this game at 2.5 currently would be backing the Cleveland Browns. The way that I look at this game is quite simply, you have a veteran quarterback, a veteran head coach, a veteran play caller going on the road to Houston, a venue where they just played a couple of weeks ago, facing a first-time head coach, first-time quarterback, first-time play caller in the playoffs, and an offense that is void quite a few weapons. I think Cleveland is able to find success through the air, but also running the football as well. We saw the Houston Texans run defense, which was held in very high regard, get absolutely gashed by Jonathan Taylor and the Colts just a week ago. There's also the element that the Browns are coming off a rest week, which they probably very well needed, while the Texans had to play to the end, and they aren't getting the benefit of that rest in the final week, had to play to the end to get into the playoffs. And so I think that sets up for the Cleveland Browns. That would be my opinion. Now, again, I'm going to caveat a lot of these. Haven't released anything. Let's talk about a couple things in this game, which I think are important. First and foremost, let's just get it out of the way, because you're going to hear it mentioned a couple times here on the show. You're going to hear it mentioned a lot of other places in media as well. These quarterbacks making their first playoff start and how that's typically been an underperform. So let's pull up some numbers. We got some graphics here. For the first time ever, a little bit of extra time on Monday and Tuesday. You can tell by the quality. I made these myself. QBs making their first playoff start. 37% against the spread when they're playing against a non-first-time starter. 41% of those games have been double-digit losses. 65% of those quarterbacks have a lower-than-average QBR. So it's one thing to say, hey, this is a really tough spot for these quarterbacks. When they're playing these veteran starters on the other side, they don't perform well against the spread. That makes sense. But we have to put some sort of qualifying factor to that. And the fact is that not only do these quarterbacks struggle in these spots, they really underperform. 65% of them are lower than the league average QBR for the season. All four of these quarterbacks, even Mason Rudolph in his couple starts, are in the 9 to 13 range for QBR on the season. And so if you're expecting a downturn from that, you can see how low that these quarterbacks might fall off. And you obviously get CJ Stroud in this spot as the rookie making his first start. There's qualifiers for rookies that tend to perform a little bit worse as well in these spots, but it's a real thing. Like, it definitely matters, and it stands out, and you see it every single season. And it's been with decent quarterbacks too. The one real exception in all of this was Daniel Jones, who had that game against the Vikings last year where the Vikings were a historic overperform during the regular season and arguably one of the most overrated playoff teams that have ever played. But other than that, it's decent quarterbacks that have made their first starts and really, really struggled. So those are some numbers you have to think about when it comes to these first-time quarterbacks. What I think is going to be another key talking point in this game too, and again, we'll pull up some more of these beautiful overlays. Let's talk about the Texans offense going against opposing defenses, because I think that this becomes important now. You're saying, okay, you have the first-time head coach, you have the first-time play caller, you have the first-time QB making their start. There's an element to this where you look at who the Texans have played, especially to get in, and you start to have a couple questions. So here are the wins for Houston this season against opponents and how those teams have finished in their defensive EPA ranking. So the Colts finished 20th. That was who the Texans played just a couple of days ago, last Saturday. But we look at kind of the trajectory for this Houston offense getting into the playoffs. They beat Tennessee twice. The Titans finished the season 27th in defensive EPA. They beat the Broncos. The Broncos finished 23rd in defensive EPA. They beat the Cardinals. Arizona finished 32nd in defensive EPA. They beat the Bengals. Cincinnati finished 28th in defensive EPA. The Bucs closer to average, 18th. But you have to go all the way back to week 5 for the Saints game, where they played the Saints and won. New Orleans finished 5th. And then they have 2 very early season wins way back in September against Pittsburgh and Jacksonville, 7th and 13th, respectively. So you have kind of a lot of hype around the Houston Texans, Coach of the Year, CJ Stroud, Offensive Rookie of the Year. This offense is trending high. They're getting into the playoffs. But you look at this sort of path that they've taken, 28th, 32nd, 23rd, 27th, twice, 20th down the stretch. They just haven't beat a lot of top-tier defenses to get into the playoffs. And every time they've stepped up in class, they've tended to have struggled. Now, obviously, at the bottom, we see the Cleveland Browns, Cleveland number 1 in defensive EPA on the season. So you're going from basically this 3-month stretch for Houston where the wins have come against bottom 10, bottom 12, even bottom 6 defenses week after week after week. Now they're stepping up to play defense number 1 in the NFL. It's a big step up in class. And you think about the spot for the quarterback and the play caller and the head coach, you can kind of see this becoming a bit of a daunting task. The direct kind of comparison or counterpoint to this would be, well, you have a Cleveland Browns defense that's really, really good at home. Now they're going on the road, and they've really struggled on the road. This could be a spot where Houston finds success because the Browns defense, it's not the same at the home as it is. It's not the same on the road as it is at home. Now the Browns are laying 2.5 points on the road. Like, what happens when this defense comes back? Let's put some sort of sense around this and some truth behind it too. So here are the Browns' home road defensive splits on the season in terms of categories and where they rank. Points per game, Cleveland at home is first. When they go on the road, it drops to 21st. That's a massive difference between home and road performance. You can't ignore that. That's a 30-point ranking drop-off. Massive when you're going from first to 31st. It's a real thing. Pass yards per game, they drop from first to 10th. Yards per play, first to 23rd. Yards per pass, first to 17th. EPA per play against the pass, first to 6th. But here's what I want to point out, because this is going to be discussed a ton this week. The positive pass play rate for the Cleveland Browns defense, home and road, are both number 1 in the NFL. They're the best down-to-down defending the pass in the NFL, whether it's at home or whether it is on the road. And where this is interesting is you're saying, like, how can this be? You're looking at points per game, first versus 31st. You're looking at yards per play, first versus 23rd. You're looking at yards per pass, first to 17th. How can that be true? But then also when you're looking at down-to-down metrics on the season, they're first at home and first on the road. And we're not talking about an insignificant amount of downs in this sample either. We're talking about 225 dropbacks that the Browns have had to defend. What really stands out when you look at the Cleveland defense is how many big plays and somewhat fluky big plays they have had against them while playing on the road. And you look back week per week, George Pickens, 70-plus yard touchdown. Michael Pittman, 70-plus yard touchdown. There's so many of these one-off 65, 70-yard touchdowns. I went back game by game. I counted 5 of them individually from different games where there was a 65-yard plus pass. DK Metcalf had a 50-yard reception that didn't go for a touchdown. They conceded another big play later in the season that didn't go for a touchdown. So not only have there been 5 of these 65-plus yard touchdowns against the Browns on the road, there's been some other big pass plays too. But when it comes to down defense, they've actually been really good over the whole of the 225 dropbacks that they have had to defend. So it's really kind of a noisy comment and stat to say that this Browns defense is significantly worse on the road than they are at home, because they've been just as good down, home and a road. So it's an interesting kind of thing to look at. Now, the big thing that would kind of wrap up this whole argument is you have a Cleveland Browns defense that can get a ton of pressure. And CJ Stroud facing pressure versus kept clean in the pocket has some of the most extreme splits that there is. And so I think that there's going to be a ton of variance in this Houston Texans offense against this Browns defense, where it comes down to, can Houston find the big play? They certainly have shown the willingness to do that with CJ Stroud, but a lot of those big plays that Stroud looks for and hunts are from a clean pocket. And that's why I think the pressure up front for Cleveland is really going to dictate how this matchup plays out. The home road splits comparison that is going to be discussed a lot is very noisy and not necessarily true. This is a very good defense. And so when you're looking at this game, the question becomes, do you trust Cleveland with the veteran QB, the veteran play caller, the veteran head coach? Do you trust that it's another bad spot for these young quarterbacks and young coaching staff making their debut? And do you trust that the Cleveland Browns defense can avoid giving up the big play? If so, you're going to see value in Cleveland. If your answer is no to those, and you think that the Browns have got a little bit fortunate from playing Davis Mills when they had to come to Houston a couple weeks ago, from playing Trevor Siemian on the short week, and you think that some of these wins for Flacco are a little bit fraudulent, if you think that is the case, you're probably looking at this game where you can get Houston +3, -120, and saying CJ Stroud is much better than Davis Mills as a quarterback. Having Nico Collins back is an upgrade for the Texans. That game earlier in the season, Cleveland closed 3.5 in Houston. That was just a couple of weeks ago. And we can now get to 3 -20 with Stroud and Collins. And you're potentially looking at Jonathan Gennard back, and you have Will Anderson with another week to get healthy. You probably see some value in Houston at that price, saying that it has just gone a little bit too far. So that'll wrap up the Cleveland Houston breakdown. Let's get to a couple of questions here on this game specifically. Connor says, if this betting thing doesn't work out, you could be a Photoshop teacher. It was a 20-minute YouTube tutorial and about 2.5 hours spent in Canva. So I'm doing it for you guys to try add some visual reinforcement with a little bit of extra time, not having to record or do any media on Monday or Tuesday. Couple more comments. Paul says, could we not treat last week's game against the Colts on the road a win to get in game as a playoff-esque? I'm not sure what you mean by that. If you want to kind of clarify in the chat, let me know. Murray, big comparison. Stroud reminds me of the up-and-coming Mahomes a few years ago. My goodness, that certainly stands out as a big comparison for sure. Mark, what about the Cleveland defensive splits on the road? We just talked about that in a pretty good detail. I think there's a ton of noise in those numbers. Give the graphic guy a raise. I'll give myself a raise for that one. Appreciate it. Hopefully, we got a few more to come. Hopefully, they hold steady and provide some more insight as well. Carl says, Cleveland home has a slow grass surface and usually bad weather greatly helps defenses. It does, and I agree with that, but the down to down has been the same home or away. They've been top in the league. There is a drop off in that, but they still have been top in the league. Terry says Cleveland D does suck on the road, but not sure the narrative sustains in the playoffs. This is why the NFL is great. This is why I love it, because everybody has a strong opinion and is passionate, and you hear these things and they get reinforced. But again, you look at some of these numbers here, it's not the case. Once you go past the counting stats for points per game and yards per play, it's not the case when you're looking at down to down. So I tend to disagree with that a little bit for sure. Think he means in essence, Colts Houston was a playoff game. I see. Yeah. So CJ's second playoff game. I think it's different. I think it's a different thing when you feel it too watching it on TV. I don't want to comment for the players. I've not been in an NFL locker room, but you know that there's a difference when you see it. I think that doesn't necessarily apply to this one too. Connor says number just feels right at 3. I tend to agree with that, but as I said, you can kind of make the argument here for both sides. Any thought on the total in Cleveland, Houston? Not really. I really like the over the first 2 times these teams played. I had it as a Nesson play for the week. There was a lot of kind of lucky, fluky things that went on. A couple big plays for Cleveland. You had the kick return for Houston. There was a flurry of points in the second quarter. Yeah, nothing at 44.5 for me in this total on this one. Last one for Cleveland and Houston. Does Cleveland play a lot of man coverage? Yes, they do. If so, how does Stroud fare against man? I should have brought that one up. That would be a good point. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head on that one, but that is something that if you ask down in the comments post-show, I'll go through and check it out and get you those exact splits. Next game, Saturday night. It is the late game, 5:15 p.m. Pacific time. Miami Dolphins on the road at the Kansas City Chiefs. Kansas City, a 4-point favorite now across the board with a total in this game of 44.5. So we started last game's breakdown by talking about that big overarching narrative that you're going to hear a ton. In this game specifically, what you are going to hear a ton between now and kickoff is how cold it is going to be at Arrowhead Stadium. Our internal weather expert had the report this morning, and I'm reading it off. There was a high of 0 degrees. There is 13 to 15 mile per hour winds with gusts up to 18 to 21 miles per hour. The big thing that stands out here is 0 degrees. Now, Fahrenheit, Celsius gets me all twisted up, but 0 degrees, significantly below freezing. That is a very cold day. We've got a massive polar vortex hugging, consoling the entire continent, essentially, from the middle portion up of the United States. It's going to be ugly here. It's going to be ugly in Buffalo. There's going to be a ton of weather talk. But let's talk about what extreme cold means, because I think it gets discussed on broadcasts in other shows that it's extremely cold. You're going to have to run the football more. It's going to be very difficult to tackle. You're going to have offenses playing slower and passing drops off. And none of that is necessarily true relative to cold on its own. So does cold mean lower scores? This goes back to 1994. Now, 10 degrees or colder, this game falls into that sample, but it's only 13 games in the last 30 years that have fit into this. We've seen 10 degrees or colder games at kickoff, 43.1 points. But as you can see, whether you go to 20 degrees or colder, 32 degrees or colder, there's just not that big of a difference when it comes to just cold weather having an impact on scoring. And what you tend to see is that the wind is the one factor which week after week, season after season, has a big impact on offensive output. And there was a really good article written by Sean Ronka that went through passing output when it's cold relative to different weather types and different scenarios. And what was found is in these extreme cold games, the passing output on average per team relative to what they have done during the regular season has fell off about 5%. And so the cold weather impact that gets built up in the media just isn't as true or impactful as it sounds like it should be. It's just not necessarily the case. There is going to be a lot of talk about Miami being a South Florida team, warm weather, coming into Arrowhead and playing outdoors. That's a very difficult thing that you kind of have to look at and try to figure out to quantify. It sounds really good. There's probably some reality to it. It's very hard to sort of put that into a price. When I look at this game specifically, I see the total currently at 43.5 at Caesars. It is 44 at Chris. There's 44.5 as the absolute peak elsewhere, but we'll call it a consensus 44 in this game. I think you have to look to the over, and that would be my opinion in this spot. A couple things would lead me to look at that. First of all, when these two teams played in Germany earlier in the season, it was a total that closed significantly higher. The game obviously played under, but a couple things came from that, which I think stand out. First of all, in the early portion of the game, you saw the Kansas City Chiefs break out of a bit of a play calling rut, and the offense looked a lot different. And I think there's definitely something to that, where you see the offensive play calling for Kansas City from Andy Reid in these high leverage games stand out and look a lot different. And so I think in a sense, you're getting the good plays, as you might label it, from Andy Reid, definitely and obviously in a situation like this. There forever, as long as I have been alive, the discussion about Andy Reid out of the bye with extra prep. I know it wasn't an official bye last week, but everybody for Kansas City that mattered got a rest. And nothing they put forth on the field against the Chargers suggests that that was a game where there was much attention. I knew somebody that went to the game, was very close to the sideline. He said that the sideline was incredibly disinterested and classified it as lukewarm. It's very clear that the Chiefs had their focus on this game. So I think you get some element of that Andy Reid angle playing into this. You also wonder about Travis Kelce, who clearly was not been 100% down the stretch. Did he potentially have injuries? Was he a little bit banged up? He had the week to rest. All of that, I think, fits in very well to Kansas City. You also have Isaiah Pacheco, who was banged up, who got the week of rest, who now gets to face a Dolphins defense that is extremely void of talent at linebacker. I mean, it's incredible how many guys the Dolphins have lost. They had to go sign 3 guys off of the street to come and fill in for this game. So not only do I think Pacheco has a path to success, but I also think that the Chiefs' offensive tackles, which have been turnstiles in many ways the last 5 or 6 weeks since the Smith injury, also get a lot of relief, because where these injuries have hit the Dolphins most significantly is outside linebacker on those edge rushers. And so if you take away those top rushers for Miami on defense, and all of a sudden you open up opportunities in the middle of the field to tight ends, to a slot receiver like Rice, there's a really comfortable path here for the Chiefs to find success on offense, where the vulnerability of the offensive line is not going to be tested, and Mahomes, by nature of that, becomes more comfortable in the pocket. So I think that this sets up quite well for the Chiefs offense in this game. When I look at the other side, I think back to the first meeting in Germany, the game was kind of quirky in how the Chiefs got out to that big lead, and then they got that turnover right at the end of half that they returned, and it forced Miami into a bit of a different game plan right from the start. And what showed through in the second half was that Kansas City, who's had this issue defending the run for a long time, became quite vulnerable to defending the run in the second half against Miami. I think Miami's going to be able to run it on the Chiefs. All signs point to Mostert coming back. I don't think he's 100%. Achan's still dealing with the injury as well. I don't think he's 100%, but having them both out there, I think is going to make a big deal. And I think, like we saw the Dolphins finish that game at the end in the second half in Germany, they're going to be able to carry that over and run on Kansas City. And if you like the cold weather narrative, to where the passing game downgrades a little bit, but you still get the run game have a ton of success, you probably see the path for the Dolphins with their run game that they can scheme up look really good. It looked great against Buffalo early in the first half before that game got a little bit out of hand too in the second half, and Miami was forced into something different. I also think it looked pretty good when you go back to last year's playoffs when it was Skylar Thompson going on the road to Buffalo. What McDaniel was able to get out of Thompson and offensive weapons in that game, it wasn't a massive output, but it far exceeded the expectations that any of us had on McDaniel in his first playoff game like that, with a first-time starter in Thompson, a spot we talked about teams really struggling. All of a sudden, it didn't look all that bad relative to the expectations put on it. And so if you get a spot here where Waddle comes back and Mostert is back, and you have the ability to run on this Chiefs defense, which is really good, and you have the Chiefs on the other side, kind of all points to me like a game that should go over this total of 44. And I get a little bit kind of confused or weirded out in a way that I'm looking at Joe Flacco versus first-time starter CJ Stroud in Browns Texans, and so many questions about that with the Browns defense that's number one, and that totals 44.5. And here we have a game that's not going to have the wind impact. It's going to be cold, but we've talked about how that doesn't necessarily have the big impact. And you have two play callers who, all of us watching this stream, all 400 plus of us, would say, well, Reed and McDaniel are better play callers than what you're getting from Stefanski and what you're getting from Slowick. And this total is half a point less. I don't know if I agree with that. And so there has been some over money coming in the last little bit. I think that probably continues to show in as people get around this cold weather narrative not mattering. And we might see this total tick up. So my opinion on this one would be the over in this one. Let's get to a couple questions here. Thank you. Insight, 0 degrees Celsius equals 32 Fahrenheit. You'd have to tell me what 0 Fahrenheit means in Celsius. I know it's not good. I can tell you that for sure. Maybe not as bad as what yours truly grew up with in northern Saskatchewan. I feel like it was probably a little bit colder than that, for sure. Other questions? Carl Felice. Okay, good point. I missed this one. Miami defense got shredded versus Buffalo. Kansas City won't struggle as much in the red zone. So in the first half, every single Bills drive went for 65 yards or more. They came away with 7 points. You're very right. That defense got absolutely shredded. There were so many points in that game. That game stayed under somehow. There were so many points in that game unrealized that you're absolutely right. I completely agree with that for that Dolphins defense. That's a big issue with all of those injuries now. It's just not going to change a whole bit. Gerard says Kelsey has been ineffective the last 3 weeks. I think that the rest really will help him. I think that stands out. -18, -17. Yeah, that's a warm winter day where I come from, but certainly for football weather, that is as cold as it gets. So that definitely stands out, but don't let it think you that the cold weather will have just a massive impact on the under in this one or just kill both offenses. That's not necessarily the case historically in these games. Let's get to Sunday as we look at the Pittsburgh Steelers on the road at the Buffalo Bills. Buffalo, a 10-point favorite in this game. Total in this game, 36, shaded towards the under. Opener in this game was 44.5 on the total. So we are looking at nearly a 8-point move, touchdown plus, as this number has crashed down. The old voice is getting a little weary here at the end of football season. I have to take a sip. Why is the total coming down? The easiest thing to talk about, wind. Now, the speculation on the wind in this game is a little bit tricky to navigate through. The forecast right now projects that before the game starts, so right in the 7 to 10 a.m. window, and again, I'm talking East Coast time here, so I'm getting my Pacific and East Coast times, but it's about a 2 to 3 hour gap before the game kicks off. There are these sustained winds in Buffalo right around 35 to 40 miles per hour. During the game, the wind tends to trend out a little bit, and we are seeing, again, based on what we have reported internally, 23 mile per hour sustained winds with gusts up to 38 miles per hour. Now, once wind exceeds the 20 mile per hour mark, every mile per hour higher that the wind is sustained at, there is a significant drop off in passing production. This is the one situation and weather mix where you see scoring really impacted in a big way. And so if we get to a game later in the week where you get these wind speeds 25 mile per hour plus, and the forecast is more concrete and you're close to it, this is going to have a big impact on how offenses can move the football. You also have the combination that it's 75% chance of snow in this game. If you have blowing snow that is sticking to the field with 25 plus mile per hour winds, a case can be made that the total of 36 is going to be too high still. You think back to the Jets-Pats game last week, similar conditions, not as bad wind. That game was getting bet under on game day when the limits were highest. The total in that game was 29, and it ended up closing at 28. So there's still room here based on how this weather is trending for this total to potentially go down. Now, you have to kind of keep an eye on this because as the week progresses, it's really going to depend on how does that earlier wind that is before the game, how is that going to slide? Is it going to move into the game window or is it going to be pushed back? That will dictate where this total is going to go. If it pushes back and we have this around like the low 20s, you're probably going to see this total tick up a little bit. 20 mile per hour games average a closing total of 37.5 going back the last 10 years. We're right in that range right now, 36, 36.5. So you have to watch on that. The wind is going to dictate what this total does. When we get to the side, which I think is more interesting to talk about, we saw the Bills go to 10.5 for like a half second yesterday at Circa. Pittsburgh Steelers money came back into the market right away. And you start to look at this, and there's no question that it's been a pretty significant increase for the Buffalo Bills the last couple of weeks as they get into the playoffs. They were a very popular buy low about 5 to 6 weeks ago. It's been steady trending upward since. And now you have the Bills at a pretty extreme price point in this game with a very short total. But let's talk about what is happening, because if you watch the Sunday Night Football game, you would be led to believe that Josh Allen and this offense with Joe Brady is now turning everything around, and this is a big offensive improvement for the Bills, when the fact is that it's the complete opposite. Look at some of these numbers. I think it's very interesting. So we'll look at the Bills offense with Dorsey versus Brady. So the Bills offense with Ken Dorsey listed on the left, the Bills offense with Joe Brady listed on the right. So it's 5% worse down-to-down success rate with Joe Brady. It's 7% worse down-to-down passing success rate with Joe Brady. It's 2% worse running success rate down-to-down with Joe Brady. It's 0.6 yards per play worse and a quarter point per drive worse. So even though the Bills have gone through and made the offensive coordinator change that happened to coincide immediately with when the Bills started playing well and when they started playing like the team that we had expectations on them were, this is not coming from the offense. If you look at the offense as a whole since Joe Brady took over, you could say that the offense is struggling and has got worse than what it was earlier in the season. So where is all of this improvement coming from? Well, if it's not the offense, it's got to be the defense. And weirdly, what we're seeing is before and after the firing, the Bills defense has improved in yards per play from 24th to 6th, in QBR rating against from 25th to 4th, in EPA per play from 10th to 6th. And here's the big one, turnover margin, -5 to +3. So all of this improvement late in the season has come from the Bills defense. And it's a couple things at play here. First, you have the fact that the offense is not turning the ball over nearly as much as they were in the beginning portion of the season when Ken Dorsey was the offensive coordinator. And this is including what we saw from Josh Allen in that game against the Dolphins on Sunday night. So you have that. The Bills are taking better care of the football. You have health returning to the Bills. Daquan Jones came back. They were able to acquire Rasul Douglas through the trade, which worked out very well. Other guys on the defensive line got healthier too. So you get all of these defensive improvements and health upticks. All of a sudden, the Bills defense starts to play like the unit that the expectations had set earlier in the season. And you kind of see a different version of it that was really impacted by the loss of Tre'Davious White, by the loss of Matt Milano, by the earlier season loss of Daquan Jones, who was just a beast at the start of the year in generating pressure. And all of this is kind of pointing to this Bills defensive rise. And really, we're waiting to see what comes from this offense. Where this becomes really interesting to me, and I think this is the best point to talk about in the game. The Bills last year lost in the playoffs against the Cincinnati Bengals, which eliminated them. Think back to what that game was. It was an outdoor game in the snow with wind. And the Bills offense looked horrible. It was one of the worst offensive performances we've seen from the Bills all season. On YouTube right now, there is an Isaiah McKenzie interview from the summer. And he talked about that game specifically. And there's a clip that only has a couple hundred views, but I think it's a terrific podcast insight that you can kind of use to think about how this game might play out. In that interview, Isaiah McKenzie went on about how the biggest impact to the Bills offense in that game that they were not prepared nor equipped for was the snow. And it's weird because when we think about what we hear in the media, it's Josh Allen, who came from a college where he was always playing in the wind. It's Buffalo in this extreme weather. You have him with this strong arm and this Bills downfield passing game. Like, they're built for these kind of conditions. And truth is, they're really not, especially in the passing game, which is weird because of his arm strength. But the route combinations were highly criticized by McKenzie in that podcast clip. It's about 4 minutes. And he just went on about how everything's too complex. Everything's requiring curl routes and too much when the footing is uncertain. And there's so much timing that when you have a little bit of wind, it just throws everything off. And there was no ground game for them last year. And so it was a big problem. And so you think about that and you're like, well, now that we're talking about the weather, we've got 75% chance of snow. We've got wind. isn't that going to be the same thing in this game? Two things stand out. First of all, you have a Bills team this year that has made it a priority to run the football. Last year, they were throwing the football 45, 50 times a game. This year, they're getting, whether it be Cook, whether it be Allen with his legs, especially later in the season, since the offensive coordinator change, they have been willing to get the ground game going at almost any cost, especially since the coordinator shift to Joe Brady. You also have the fact that the Bills were burned in that scenario a season ago. We talked about the Ravens mid-season with the London trip and how the Ravens, a smart organization, they got burned in London. And Harbaugh wanted to make a statement that that was not going to happen again this season. They hired the team that equipped them on how to better prepare and game plan for that London game. They went into Tennessee and looked completely different. They got the win. There's a sense of priority with similar situations, I believe, for the Bills in this game to not go out in the same manner that they did a year ago. And so as I kind of put this all together, I think about this matchup against the Steelers at home, in cold, in wind, in snow, where a year ago, if we're talking about it, was all the reason in the world for the Bills to struggle. I just think this is a completely different Bills team and a completely different Bills offense that is so much better equipped to handle this scenario and this situation than they were a year ago, that I think there's extra emphasis to get it right in this spot, learning from the mistakes a year ago. And you also have the defensive uptick to support Buffalo in this game as well. And not only are the Steelers going to be without TJ Watt, but it's a spot where I think you're going to see the Bills be able to move the ball on the ground very consistently against the Steelers defense, where they're not going to be exposed to those conditions. So I think that that's a big boost here, both from a focus standpoint, but also from a necessity standpoint, that is going to work into the Bills' favor quite a bit. Now, what I would say about this too on the other side, if we switch to Pittsburgh, Mason Rudolph has got a lot of praise for what he has done. I look at what Rudolph has done. He beat a Bengals defense, which we talked about in the Houston breakdown as being one of the worst in the NFL. He played a Ravens team that was full of backups. They didn't play any starters. And I get that it's looked good, but in similar conditions, he also played the Seahawks defense, which is one of the most confusing units. We'll get to that in a second. But I look at what Rudolph did last week in similar conditions, albeit more rain than we're going to get this week. I don't think you're going to see as much snow or precipitation. Rudolph completed one pass to Johnson that went for a big gain and a touchdown on broken coverage against backups. I didn't see anything last week that suggests to me that the Steelers are going to be able to carry over that game plan going on the road in the playoffs into Buffalo, where you have the Mason Rudolph first-time playoff QB angle. We've talked about how much that suppresses things. To me, that's a very, very tough spot to expect much from the Steelers offense in this game against this Bills defense that is improving so much. And if it's not going to be a big Warren game, you get the ineffective Najee Harris running into the back of offensive linemen. To me, this is a tough spot for the Steelers. So my opinion here would be Bills. I would say at 10, big number to be laying, even with the matchup advantages that show up and the defensive uptick we've seen from the Bills. I think prop-wise, Bills running the football stands out quite a bit too. So really stands out quite a bit to me in this game. Morgan says, please tell us why the line has not moved off of 10 with the total plummeting. Math would tell. So logic says total coming down 8 points, point spread going up, doesn't match. Typically when a total comes down and you have a big point spread like this, lower expectation for points, why is this not coming down? Well, I would say this is a bit of a unique scenario. 1 of 6 games on the board. Opened 7.5. It was bet. Got bet at 8. Got bet at 8.5. Got bet at 9. Got bet at 9.5. Got bet at 10. You didn't see Steelers money in the market till 10.5. With the uncertainty of the weather, I get that the total has come down a lot. It's not like this is a weather system nor news that came in later in the week. We're not here Wednesday morning saying, hey, this might be windy. Like Sunday night, we knew that weather was going to be an impact, and the Bills were still getting bet. So to me, it's tough to go back against that when you have this wave of money that came in early on Buffalo telling you what the side was and what it was going to be if you're a bookmaker. It's tough to go the other way just because the total is coming down, especially when there's only 6 games on the board. So, yeah, that would kind of be my reasoning for why this has not come down a little bit further in favor of the Buffalo Bills. Thank you, Andy. There's no way that coffee is getting finished during the live stream. I can tell you that. That would be unprecedented territory if we're making it. It is already incredibly room temperature as it was brewed 65 minutes ago. So we're kind of stuck in no man's land. Let's get to the middle Sunday game in this one. Green Bay Packers on the road at the Dallas Cowboys. Cowboys, a 7.5-point home favorite. Total in this game, 50.5. The total has been back and forth. Seen it at 51, have seen it at 50, 49.5, bouncing back and forth. The side has been more one way. Like DK opened 7.5, it got bet to 7. Then once it was more widely open, the 7s got taken. We're sitting at 7.5 in this game. We're kind of locked in this spot specifically. So I think this is a pretty interesting storyline game, and maybe not for the most, well, I would say it's a pretty obvious reason. You have the Mike McCarthy game against his old team that he took to the championship. I think this is a massive, massive, massive game for Mike McCarthy. And my initial feeling when I was looking at this was Dallas can run the Packers out of the building. But as I thought about that, and I'm like, how am I not betting Dallas immediately once this opened? There's something that I don't trust about Mike McCarthy, especially in this spot. We've seen him, I would say, for the last month, Seattle game, the Detroit game. There are other examples where late game play calling for him and decision making, he's got bailed out. And the criticism around Mike McCarthy is his late game management. That's always been a big issue for him. That's where he takes all the heat. He tightens up. He makes weird decisions. This year in games, as we're watching it, he's not really getting anything right. And he's fortunate that Dan Campbell and the referees took away his blunder late against Detroit. He also got bailed out in the Seattle game by his defense. There's been cases lately where you're starting to see that Mike McCarthy we know kind of crack under pressure. And there's something for me that I don't trust in this spot when you're laying the number. Now, let's just put that on the side and we'll talk about matchups here a little bit further, because the big and obvious thing to me in this is the Green Bay Packers defense against the Cowboys offense. And to me, this is just a massive mismatch, however you want to look at this. Now, I think what makes it even more of a mismatch than perhaps is being warranted in the market is just how Joe Barry specifically finished the season against certain quarterbacks. So let's talk about kind of a lucky run out here for Joe Barry. The final 5 weeks of the season, Green Bay ranked 27th, 5th worst in EPA per play allowed on defense. But look at who they have faced down the stretch. You played Justin Fields in the final game. The OC for Chicago just got fired. That was kind of writing on the wall, knew it was coming. It was an eliminated team that was semi-dead, with Eberflus saying he didn't want to play up the spoiler role in Chicago. So that was the last game. The game before that, you played Jaron Hall and Nick Mullins, who split. It was a rookie making is his second start. I mislabeled the graphic. He had that one where he got injured. So you have Hall making the start. Nobody really knew why. The Vikings were getting blown out. They switched to Nick Mullins. The Packers get a couple fourth down stops in the second half, but it's Hall and Mullins. The week prior, it's Bryce Young. Bryce Young had his best game of the season. Packers end up getting away with it. The week before, it was Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield has his best game of the season. The week before, you have Tommy DeVito. I don't even know what his professional job title is now. Is it Instagram pizzeria influencer? Is it quarterback? I don't know. Joe Barry apparently didn't know either. He allowed DeVito to put up 260 combined yards, didn't force DeVito into any mistakes. So despite the Packers making this run to get into the playoffs, they face Fields, Hall, Mullins, Young, Mayfield, DeVito the final 5 weeks of the season, and they rank 27th against those quarterbacks down the stretch. And so to me, I'm thinking about this, and I'm like, now you have this defense going into Dallas to play the Cowboys, who are league best at home, play-to-play, EPA, electric, putting up all these points, 35-plus points a game at home. You have the cadence works better. You see Dallas play with more tempo. You see Dallas get more plays off. And it's like, how you can't get a bigger step up in class for a defense than what the Packers have done the last 5 games, now going on the road into Dallas. And that's where I see there's just this massive potential for Dallas to hang a huge number here and blow the Packers out of the building. On the other side, you have a situation where it's the first time rookie quarterback on the road making his playoff debut, and Jordan Love, a spot that it's going to be a massive talking point this year. It's a consistent underperform for all of these quarterbacks in this spot, facing the Cowboys defense that can generate a lot of pressure up front. It seems like a tough scenario. The caveat to this would be that we saw Jordan Love go into a big game situation on Sunday night against the Kansas City Chiefs, play completely risk-free and look awesome. We saw him go into a massive spot in the division on the road against the Lions on Thanksgiving Thursday, played completely risk-free. LaFleur even talked about it, taking those shots on the opening drive. He looked great. He looked amazing in that game and what he was able to do. And so perhaps when you're looking at these 4 quarterbacks in this spot making their debut, maybe you're looking at this as, okay, that's a narrative that's priced into the market. Maybe you're looking at Dallas at home, most certainly priced into the market. And you're looking at a spot where perhaps Love is not as bad projections-wise in this spot as he should be, especially with Gilmore a little bit banged up on the Cowboys' back end. Maybe you see the Packers and you can make a case for them that this is just the Cowboys' home game that's too inflated. I can see it both ways. My opinion in this spot would be to trust what's real here and fade the Joe Barry defense and back Dallas minus 7.5. But I've flip-flopped quite a bit in this game. I think that this defense for Green Bay, as bad as they have ranked, should look a lot worse than they actually are. And that's concerning for me in this one. But again, what keeps me away here is I don't know if I trust Mike McCarthy in this spot in a game that is this significant for him against his old team, against his old franchise. This is a massive game that you're going to need him to really get right to cover this big of a number at home. And so another tough one, but my opinion here would be Dallas in this spot. Those past calls against the Lions were brutal, Murray. You're right. I would say something else about the Cowboys offense, which we'll get to in more of a Lions breakdown, but a lot of unrealized points from quirky things for the Cowboys at end of drives the last couple of weeks. That is interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. The Dallas or juggernauts at home is outdated, in my opinion. They haven't been great in the last 5 weeks of the season. They beat up on the Commanders and the Broken Eagles, fortunate elsewhere. So graphic guy didn't have enough time to put this all together. But I think that this is a good point from Nathan. If you look at the Cowboys' offensive production over the last, I would even go back a little bit further than this, Nathan. I would say almost 6 to 7 weeks. We've seen them not look nearly as good as what they were at other points during the season. And that kind of ties into, from just a points output perspective, CeeDee Lamb, turnover at the goal line, Dak through the red zone interception. Last couple of weeks, there's been some weird things at the end of drives that have not been as crisp as they were earlier in the season for the Cowboys. So just offensive comparison-wise, you can say that the Cowboys offense is downtrending a little bit coming into the playoffs, which again, you're looking at the number and you're saying like, okay, that could be a little bit inflated for sure based on just how we're talking about it overall in the game. Patrick says, absolutely love Green Bay. Young, hungry team in the ascendancy with no pressure on their shoulders versus McCarthy-led serial chokers whose stadium can turn against them on a dime. This is like a Jim Rome Collins segment, but written form context at the bottom of the screen. I can see this side of it. I can't disagree with you. Because, again, look at Thanksgiving in that Chiefs game. there's no question that what is being said here by Patrick reflected in those games from this offense. So certainly that stands out for sure. Do the Packers play man? Brad, you're putting me on the spot with this. Let's pull up. I just want to get you an exact percentage on this. I have the tendency reports here. I'm not going to pull them up on the screen. There was also the question, I believe it was about Houston, but I can pull those up. You can remind me in that if we want to look at that. The Green Bay Packers specifically play man coverage 23% of the time. It is a 21st usage rate. They play zone coverage 65% of the time. That is 12th most on the season. So much more of a zone team than a man team. But to give you some specific numbers, that is where it stands out. Goodman, we talked about this in the last breakdown. It's just because there's been so much money on Buffalo at lesser numbers standing out in that game as well. CA Sohn, when was the last time you made a pick? You waffle like your big annoying glasses older sir. Get some balls like Gianni the Greek. Stop talking in riddles. Easy take Cowboys -7.5. Well, if I had the luxury of Gianni the Greek, I could give picks out with any repercussions, and I could have my record tracked in any way that I deemed fit to make it a sufficient record to support anything that I want to look at and sell. Luckily for me on the stream, I have to match the ethics and standards that have been set by RAS for the last 20 years. And I'm not going to give out a pick that I'm not betting on, nor that I don't fully believe in. And so the reason I'm waffling is because I'm up here saying I haven't made a bet in any of these games. And I'm not going to say something just for the sake of making a bet when I'm not actually betting it, because I know that people following this, unlike other shows, are putting their hard-earned money on these bets. And if I'm going to have that responsibility to have an opinion dictate how people are betting their money, I don't want to give something out that I'm not confident in. So yes, I'm waffling, but I'm also trying to give as much value from a handicapping perspective as I can, rather than throwing out picks that I'm not fully backing and betting myself. And so the reason you're seeing it go back and forth is because of that. And unfortunately, it represents the time of year in NFL. It's hard to do playoff content because we have 6 games that everybody is betting on. It's Wednesday morning. A lot of these lines have moved. It's a very tough market to beat. When you're watching the live streams week 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 in the season, when there's a lot of opportunities, you're getting bets on every game. Go back and watch some of the earlier live streams. We had some shows where there was 7, 8, 9 bets given out on a show with a lot of conviction. But now we're late in the season. Now we're into the playoffs. It's really, really hard. It's hard to find good bets that can win. So that's why there's been a lot of waffling and still will be. But as I said at the start, we're going to have an opinion given on each side or total in this, which we've been giving on each of these. But you're very unlikely to get me having a strong conviction stance on an NFL playoff game that I'm fully behind, because it's just really, really hard to do. If it happens, you're probably going to know that it's the real deal from a pick being given out. So, again, it's part of this is when you have a pick, you stand by it. On the other side, I'm just trying to give out the best information as possible that people can use to use on their own bets to make their decisions as best as they can. Let's get to the next game. Saturday Night Football. It is the LA Rams on the road at the Detroit Lions. Current price in this game, Lions 3 -20. Total in this game, 51.5. Total has been bouncing back and forth. Side was 3.5 a little bit earlier in the week. Those 3.5s were taken out. We're now down to a -3, -20 in this game. So to me, a very interesting matchup. You have McVay versus Goff. If anybody here has followed my media, let's go back to like 2018, you'll know the whole Goff-McVay angle that we were betting on consistently, betting against. It was very real during his time in LA, where McVay worked essentially all the line of scrimmage commands for Goff until the 15-second cutoff point in the headset. And I would argue that the connection between play caller, head coach, and quarterback from a down-by-down communication standpoint for Jared Goff and Sean McVay was stronger, and Goff was more dependent on it from McVay than any QB has been in the modern era. I mean, that was something that was talked about so often and had such a big impact that now you see for the first time the reversal of that, where in a playoff game, you have McVay going up against Goff. And how is that going to play out in terms of knowing the tendencies, and how do you look at this from a matchup perspective? And so you can say just up front here, no coach or play caller knows Goff's tendencies more than Sean McVay. And I really think that as much of a narrative-y thing that this might be over the game, it really matters. And I think it will definitely have an impact. And so I think that that's a real storyline and a very interesting one to look at. Now let's talk about this game specifically. We'll start with Goff against the Rams defense. It really stands out when you look at some of these numbers. So the Rams defense plays too high shell coverage at the number one rate in the NFL. No team does it more than 70% of the time. The Rams are lining up with too high safeties in shell coverage. Here's how Jared Goff has done against too high looks. Now, this morning, I filtered out the league and all pass attempts so far this season by quarterbacks who have at least 50 passing attempts against too high coverage. That produced 16 quarterbacks. Goff has nearly 100 pass attempts against the coverage type that the Rams defense plays the most. Of those 16 qualifiers, look at how Jared Goff ranks against this coverage scheme. 14 of 16 in total EPA, 15 of 16 in completion percentage, 16 of 16 on target rate, 13 of 16 in pressure rate against, because he has to hold on to the ball for so much longer against this coverage to figure it out. His pressure rate against spikes, 12 of 16 in interception rate, dead last in touchdown rate, hasn't thrown a touchdown all season against these two deep looks. And so what the Rams do most frequently on defense is what Jared Goff struggles with the most on offense. Where this becomes interesting is when you look at the Lions offense, they have faced some extremely high rates running the football against stacked boxes, which have multiple defenders up at the line of scrimmage. That's how a lot of teams are electing to defend the Detroit Lions. The LA Rams defense stacks the box at one of the lowest rates. They're 29th in heavy box snap rate in the NFL. And so if you're thinking about this kind of out loud and you're going step by step here, you have Goff and a Lions offense, which just lost Sam Laporta, one of his favorite targets, going against a Rams defense that is led by a head coach who knows Goff's tendencies very well, that plays a type of coverage that Goff, his whole career, and especially this season, has really struggled against more than any other team in the league. However, the Rams stack the box against the run at one of the lowest rates in the league, and the Lions have not seen much of that all season long. I think there's a really good chance that the Lions, which we've come to kind of know as this confident passing team, now without Laporta in this matchup, go run heavier against this Rams defensive front. And they're probably going to have a lot of success doing it based on how LA defends the run, not from just a statistical standpoint, but also from a schematic standpoint. And so to me, this game, as much as it is going to be Goff versus McVay, is actually the dual backs for the Lions against this Rams defensive front. I think that is going to be the big matchup to have to show up. And Josh Fowler calls it out right. Are the Rams going to be able to stop the 1-2 punch of Montgomery and Gibbs? I don't think that they are. Now, the question is going to be, will the Lions be able to keep the game in a game state that is conducive to relying on those running backs leading the way? Because here's what really starts to stand out to me when I look at this. There's a lot of hidden points for the Lions defense down the stretch. Now, the Lions defense finished the season 20th in EPA per play. The final 3 weeks of the season, even with some guys getting healthier, they allowed 21 points per game. However, you look into some of these games down the stretch for the Lions defense, 6.5 yards per play against, and that was facing Nick Mullins twice and Dak Prescott and the Cowboys. And that 21 points per game number, I think, could have looked a lot worse. Look at just some of these plays from these games that stood out. Mullins threw an INT at the Lions 20. He threw another one at the 5. Prescott threw one at the 19. Lamb had the touchback fumble at the 1. And then Mullins came back and threw another interception at the Lions 13. So in the last 3 games, where the Lions defense, from a scoreboard watching perspective, looks to have improved in terms of the points allowed against that is going to be referenced. They had 4 different interceptions inside the red zone, as well as the touchback, sort of hiding among the fact that in these games as well, they've allowed 6.5 yards per play. They've only forced 9 punts total in the last 3 weeks against Nick Mullins twice and Dak Prescott and the Cowboys. So in the last 3 weeks, teams have been going up and down the field on the Lions. The Lions have just they've got quite fortunate inside the red zone against these teams with turnovers and just luck going their way. And so to me now, based on who the Lions have faced in terms of opposing offenses, the Rams come in with Stafford getting a week of rest. I mean, he's been hurt with something for the better part of 3 months. You have Kyron Williams, who came back from the injury about a month and a half ago, but now he gets a week of rest to get better. You have Cooper Kupp, who was complaining just 2 weeks ago that his body wasn't fully able to recover for these games on turf. Now he gets the week of rest and gets to fully prep for this week on turf. And you have Puka, who just set the record, didn't have to play the full game last week. He now comes in with a rest advantage. Well, so you have a Rams offense coming in with a much needed week of rest into this environment against the Lions defense that in many ways has been overperforming and getting quite lucky against Nick Mullins for 8 quarters. To me, there's a path here where the Rams have a lot of success on offense, which if the Rams are able to get out and get the early lead, then I start to wonder, can the Lions fully exploit that run game matchup they have against this Rams defense? Because if Goff is going to have to get into a drop back game where he's having 35, 40 attempts against this Rams coverage, there's not a lot of evidence that shows that he's going to have a lot of success against these coverage types. And so to me, this kind of is going to be a very game state dependent game. And that makes it really tough to look at this from a pregame perspective and throw out a strong opinion. The reason that I would look at the total, and you can look at it both ways, is if you think that the Lions are going to get the lead, then you're probably really going to like betting on the over in this game. And here's a good point coming from Nathan on McVay's tendencies. So Sean McVay's play calling tendencies, this would deserve a graphic too if the graphic guy had his shit together. Play calling tendencies for McVay. When he has a lead, ultra conservative. When he's trailing, ultra aggressive. So we just talked about how the Rams offense against the Lions defense is a very good matchup. We just talked about how the Lions offense against the Rams defense is a good matchup if the Lions are running the football. To me, when you're looking at this, if you think the Lions are going to get ahead, they're going to keep running the football. They're going to have success doing it. You're also going to speed up the Rams. You're going to get more aggressive play calling from McVay, and the secondary for the Lions is going to get exposed. That's conducive to points in the over. If you think the Rams get out to an early lead, you're forcing Goff into uncomfortable passing scenarios, and you're also setting up McVay and the Rams to this conservative play calling style that is more conducive to the under. And so when it comes to betting the total, I think it's very dependent on the side and how you look at that. I think in many ways, if you're trying to handicap the side in this game and you have strong conviction, you probably have a better bet on the total based on how you handicap it if you're getting to a point of strong conviction in this game. So a really interesting matchup back and forth that I think you really have to decide what stance you're on in that. From the chat right now, seeing a lot of love for the Rams. Connor says Rams are quietly 7-1. There was love for the other Rams as well in this game. Grabbed 3.5 on Monday for Hunter. That certainly stands out too. So very, very interesting. Have a question here from Ho Inflation, who is not happy how I went about handicapping this game specifically as we're getting to that time of year where people have a little bit more time on their hands to come in. He says, taking advice from a non-American about American sports is clearly unprofitable. When we look at the service records for a whole, which were widely available for the season on regular season and sides and totals, 52, 30, and 3 betting singles plus 18.9 units, 63.4% was the win rate against the spread for the RAS NFL service in 2023. For the weekly Nesson clip, which was posted every Wednesday or Thursday for late week sides and totals, those hit at 58%, over 40 additional picks on top of this as well. So when we're talking about unprofitable, I would strongly tend to disagree in that analysis, and the numbers both from the service and the Nesson clips and the teams that I was a part of this year would strongly disagree with that as well. Let's get into the final game in this card on Monday Night Football. It is the Philadelphia Eagles on the road at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Current price in this game, Eagles -3. Total in this game is 44 across the board. Some 43.5. So we're seeing 43.5 at FanDuel, seeing 43.5 start to lean that way at PPH as well. In this game specifically, you're just looking at a peak versus a bottom for pricing, I think is the most simplistic way that you can break down this handicap. Let's talk about the Eagles. These are using composite ratings that are based off, it includes market ratings as well as 6 different sources for power ratings in the NFL. This is the Eagles rating compared to an average team in the NFL. We look at the drop that the Eagles have incurred since week 13. They went from a season peak of 6.7 in week 12 relative to an average team in these aggregate ratings, all the way down week by week to a floor going into the Arizona game of 3.7. So you're looking at a field goal drop in the Eagles rating over a 6-week span. And the implied rating for the wild card week is 2.5 points better than an average team in the NFL. This is the lowest aggregate rating for the Philadelphia Eagles since the 2021-22 season. This is the absolute floor that we have seen for the Philadelphia Eagles over the last 2 seasons. Have not been priced lower from the aggregate ratings. So you're looking at a significant drop in this game. On the other side, we're seeing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, their rating is booming. They went from 2.1 points worse than an average football team to a current implied rating this week of 0. An exact average team in the NFL is how the Buccaneers are being priced. And you look at who they've played: Indianapolis, Carolina, Atlanta, Green Bay, Jacksonville, New Orleans, right? You're not looking like the Bucs are beating top-tier competition to get into this playoff spot and see this big adjustment up. But they're certainly getting through with wins. They got into the playoffs. They stacked a lot of wins. Complete contrasting scenarios between these two teams and how the Eagles are arriving in this game and how the Buccaneers are arriving in this game. That's why when you're looking at this, there's a very divisive opinion, because you can look at the Eagles, who have the playoff experience, who have the recent Super Bowl run last year, and you're saying, well, they're getting a bit of a premium in this spot, but now with their rating as low as it can be, you can only look to the Eagles in this spot. Then you're looking at the contrasting point to that, saying the Eagles are a dead team. Sirianni's potentially lost the locker room. They have so many injuries. They're now coming into a spot going on the road. They're overvalued. How could they ever be favored in this spot against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? There's both sides to this. What I think becomes really interesting when you're looking at this specifically, when we want to talk matchups and team tendencies, we'll get to the injuries in just a second. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers play one high shell coverage at the 4th highest rate in the NFL. They play a ton of man coverage as well. When you look at man specifically, one of the higher rates in the league, but that cover one look and that one high shell defense, the Buccaneers play at the 4th highest rate in the NFL. Mina Kimes, who's awesome from ESPN, had a big breakdown that you can go look up about how Jalen Hurts and this Eagles offense has thrived against cover one and one high shell defense looks because of both the threat to run at the quarterback position, but also the dual route ability of A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, and how that matches up so much better downfield against cover one than it does against cover two. And she really did a great job of illustrating how over the course of the season, teams have gone forward and played a much higher rate of cover two against the Philadelphia Eagles this year than they did a season ago, and how problematic that has been for the Eagles offense, especially as they went through periods of injuries to Dallas Goedert and others. And we've talked about this on the show before, but what's interesting is when you look at the defensive comparison splits during this Eagles downtrend, you're seeing them get matched up against a lot of teams that tend to sit in those cover 2 looks. And it just kind of like exacerbated the problems that the Eagles have had along with the injuries. And you now look at this matchup in this spot specifically where you get kind of the opposite, and you get this Buccaneers defense that has had the benefit of playing these NFC South teams and these NFC South quarterbacks that makes them look a lot better, but they play a style of defense that the Eagles and Hurts have had a lot of success against. And again, we talk about how teams defend the run. We just did with the heavy and light boxes for the Lions game and how much of an impact that's going to have. When you look at what the Buccaneers do, they stack the box at the 5th highest rate in the NFL. You think about a Bulls defense, it's aggressive, it's loading guys up front. And you think about what the Eagles may want to do if Hurts is less than 100%, if you have a situation where Brown's less than 100%, Smith is less than 100%. If you're going to rely on this offensive line, it's going to come down to, can the Eagles offensive line win against the Buccaneers stacking the box up front? And on paper, you would say the success that the Bucs have had when they've gone and stacked the box would lead you to believe no. When the Bucs stack the box, 5th highest rate, they're 21st success rate down to down defending the run. And when we go back to the first meeting between these two teams, you saw the Philadelphia Eagles with Swift. Some of the holes that he was able to run to were enormous. And so it was really a game and a matchup where you saw the same tendencies. The Eagles had a lot of success. I don't know if you can look at this as a game where the Buccaneers are going to come in and fundamentally change what they do on defense to such an extreme extent that they're able to mimic what other defenses have done, which have really given this Eagles offense a ton of trouble. And so I look at this game and I say, for me, it's Eagles or nothing. However, there's just this massive injury cloud that lingers over this game. As it stands right now, there's optimism that Hurts is going to be fine. There's optimism that Brown is going to play, albeit I've seen anywhere from a 20 to 30% production decrease. Smith is still a relative unknown for this game. If all 3 of those guys are able to go, and we get confirmation at some point that they're in, even if you want to gamble on that confirmation coming, to me, you have to look at this and say, you've got to take the Eagles here at 3, considering how much these ratings have come in for the Eagles, how much they're going up for the Buccaneers, the fact that Mayfield is still not 100% under center, the fact that the way that the Buccaneers play defense is very conducive for the Eagles to move the football and is where they've had success. And you're just betting on the fact that the Eagles, with this veteran leadership and talent group in the locker room, is able to get it right for this game against the Buccaneers after how bad it has gone. I think that is the way that you have to look at this game and the stance that you have to take. The defense for Philadelphia is absolutely concerning. Since the switch from Desai to Patricia has gone through, we have seen some film guys tweet out some just ridiculous matchups and mistakes and errors that this group has made. If Mayfield's not 100%, I don't think he's taking advantage of that to an extreme extent. I don't know if that's coming through. And so I think that injury side matters a lot. So I get criticized for waffling. I get criticized for going back and forth. Completely fair. If I was watching this and I didn't know the context of it, and I came across the screen and I was like, this guy's giving a lot of good information. It's a betting show. There's supposed to be picks. And he's saying this or nothing or pass or this. Like, I get it. But the fact is, you just don't know what the injury status is for a Monday night game on a Wednesday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific. I'm saying right now, if you told me that Hurts, Smith, and Brown were all good to go for this game, I would bet the Eagles at 3. And that would still be the case later in the week if that gets announced and this number is 3. If you're telling me that a combination of some of them are unable to go, I think it's going to be detrimental to the Eagles, to a matter where you may see value on the other side taking the Buccaneers getting the 3 points at home. But this is where you kind of get stuck in between with doing these streams here on a Wednesday morning, especially when you get into the postseason. So as we run this down and kind of recap, I would look Browns 2.5 would be my opinion. Chiefs and over at 4.44 would be my opinion. Bills at 10 would be the opinion. Cowboys Packers is a complete toss-up, but I would go Cowboys at 7.5 despite being scared of McCarthy. I would go Rams +3, and then you really have to look at the total on how you think about that. And then I would go Eagles at 3 at home in the final game. So that would be my opinion. But again, as the caveat, there have been no releases. There have been no bets that have been given out. I'm going to go back and just catch up on a couple comments as I got through to it. We'll leave the dumb stuff to the side, but it's nice to get some of that coming through. Fact of the matter is, when you're being honest about the plays and you're actually betting them and you're working with pros, you get to weeks where there's just not a lot going on. That's kind of the reality, especially within the NFL. Do you think Sirianni gets fired if the Eagles lose? If the rumors about him losing the locker room are true, there's probably a fair debate about that. I would be surprised if the Eagles move on from a coach that just got them to the Super Bowl and turned this team around in such a dramatic way last week. I mean, they were leading in the Super Bowl later in the game. That would be a pretty surprising move on from Sirianni. They have to figure out the coordinator stuff, though. I don't know how Matt Patricia ended up as DC in this spot. I get that Desai was struggling and this defense was struggling, but they had injury issues a lot. Linebacker position, Nakobe Dean was out. You were dealing with injuries to Blankenship. You're dealing with injuries to Slay and other corners. Like, I thought it was more injuries than it was scheme-based. And now if you want to talk about scheme being an issue, you look at the last 3 weeks of film guy breakdowns. And I mean, Patricia's getting torn apart. I don't know how he ended up in this role that he's in. That's certainly weird. So I think it's more on the coordinators than it is on Sirianni, but the way that he's handled it certainly has been a little bit odd as the season is finished and Philly has really struggled. This isn't a pick show. This is an information show. A bet you don't make is just as valuable. That's a well way to put it. Jeffrey says it well. People need to understand you don't have to bet every single game, certainly when it's late in the season with the playoffs. B. Air says, what do you make of the TJ Watt effect on the total? Does a lower total and defensive TD expectation, I believe this was the comment that came through on Twitter, offset the positive effects of Bills' regression offense upward pressure, given it is a weather game? So basically what this is asking is, since the total's coming down so far, if TJ Watt was in, would the Steelers defense perform better in a game where passing is likely less effective and you're going to need the defense to step up front? Does that not in turn, with his absence, give the Bills an out offensively? Therefore, it should potentially be going the other way, is what I think that you're asking. In which case, I could agree with that because the splits have been so significant with TJ Watt on and off the field. It's been a massive loss anytime the Steelers have been without him. And so I would agree with that sentiment that perhaps with him out there, the total could have moved up a little bit further, if that's what you're asking. To be fair, I saw your question on Twitter. I didn't quite fully understand it. And this upward, downward pressure that you're putting in is kind of tricky to decipher through. But the fact is the Steelers are a worse defense without Watt. The Bills would be able to run more without Watt. That would bode better for the total more so than the chance that Watt would produce a turnover and in turn contribute to the over as well. Nathan says, will you be joining Pizzola on his watch-alongs? I'm slated in for Monday, I think. I got a call from Alex the other day. Is it Monday or Sunday? I can't remember. I'll be on one of them this week for the first quarter now that there's less games going on, less stuff to work with, more time to watch and enjoy. So I'll be on the first quarter. I'm pretty sure it's the Eagles-Bucks game, Nathan, but they'll tweet it out. I'm on one of them, whether it's Sunday night or Monday night. I can't exactly remember as well. Gerard says, should the Seahawks move on from Pete Carroll? He's coming back, 74 years young next year. I believe they've already said that he's going to be coming back to coach another season. I thought this year was kind of like vintage Pete Carroll from a motivational and compete status that you typically get from him. I think the better question, or the bigger question, is, do you move on from Geno Smith? To which my answer would be a pretty confident yes. I think the league really figured him out the end of last season. And this season, we haven't seen him come back to that level of play that he produced early on in last season that is kind of becoming detrimental for the team. I have no idea what happened to the Seahawks defense this season. They have so much talent and name value. It never, ever got to the level of expectation that it should have. And so big questions to me. What do you do with Geno? And what do you do from a defensive coordinator standpoint? Josh, we talked about the KC weather stuff in pretty strong detail in that KC breakdown. The answer is not the cold independently, no. Any other last question, I believe, here from Robert, if anyone else has, do you see risk in betting the Rams because of the Rams kicking game, which is problematic? I do not. But Robert, I tell you, the fact that I have now said that now on air, it's almost a guarantee they're going to miss something in that game that's going to come back to bite me now that that's been brought out into the open. But no, I do not see risk in that. All right, wild card weekend down. I said it was going to be an hour. We went an hour and 35 minutes. So I was closer than usual with time estimations. But 6 games, 6 breakdowns, still no releases on the week. Anyone who is a subscriber will be updated as the week goes on. I appreciate each and every one of you for stopping by. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please do so down below. Leave a thumbs up if you are subscribed on your way out and you've got value from this. We went over 400 people on the live stream, which is a record high. So it's great we were able to do that. And again, be sure, if you are subscribed or not yet, turn on the notifications down below. There will be some game day stuff this week before games kick off that I'll be trying out to see how everybody likes it and how you enjoy it. We'll have more updates on prop stuff as well that we can discuss, and we'll catch up with any releases that may have happened during the week. Also, let me know in the comments, were the graphics helpful in any way? Can keep doing them as we try to make the show look and sound better as we go throughout the week. Now that there's a little bit more time, especially next week where there's only 4 games, we can dive in a little bit further as well. So let me know in the comments down below after the video is aired. But I appreciate everybody for stopping by. Appreciate everybody for participating in the live chat, both positive and negative comments. We'll be back on the weekend with some game day stuff. And of course, next week as well with the full live stream again for the divisional round. If I don't see you before then, enjoy the playoffs, enjoy the wild card weekend, and we'll talk to you on the next show.